So thanks for having me here, and I'm very sensitive to the fact that this is probably a different kind of talk than what you've been hearing since morning. So I'm a business school professor, whereas the talks that you've been having here are very technical today. So thanks for having me and letting me indulge in something that I've been researching for 12 years. But before I start, thanks Nicole for the opportunity to share our research. So UniSA has a strong presence here today. So the center that I'm a director of, we've got a stand outside. My colleague, Professor Bill Skinner, who's one of the world's leading professors in this area on minerals and resources. So your center's got a stand outside. So do engage with us during the tea time. So what I'm going to talk about is, so Clint, you ended with your organization's commitment to ESG. I'm going to talk about how ESG seems to be the flavor of the year, month, perhaps for the next 5 years, but how it cannot be the messiah unless we do some things. So this is what I've spent my career doing, trying to understand how organizations and societies can move towards a more environmentally progressive and a socially equitable future. And if I'd given this talk even 5 years ago, but definitely 10 years ago, I'd be trying to convince you how these challenges are real. I would have brought data from the Antarctic ice cores, and before you dismiss me as a hippie on a third floor, I would have showed you that this problem's real. I would have talked about the planetary boundaries and said, we've crossed 4 of them, and if we cross all 9, life isn't. Perhaps fortunately, perhaps unfortunately, I no longer have to talk about these issues. The problems are real, they're in our face, so we can focus on talking about some of the solutions that our research provides. So my team and I, we've been investigating ESG, sustainability, for more than a decade now, and we've published about it. And what I'll talk about today is some of our key findings in this area. And I'm delighted to be talking to the mining industry because it remains one of the major contributors to our GDP, one of our big employers, and definitely a very big contributor to our revenue. The best of times, the worst of times. At the same time, mining also contributes significantly towards waste generation, towards social sustainability challenges in some areas, and definitely towards emissions. So the core idea of what I research, ESG, environmental, social governance, is this idea that firms, all of you lead firms in some way, they should not be evaluated just on their financial performance, but also on their environmental and social performance using numeric indicators so that ESG has a legitimate seat on the table. Now, almost every firm prays at ESG's temple to an extent these days, and that's a far cry from Milton Friedman. So Milton Friedman, 1970s, the Nobel Prize winner, he argued that the only social responsibility of a business is to make profits, period because he was North American, though they don't say full stop. So he's dead, but his ideas live long. They are a dominant paradigm, whether we like it or not. The one thing that's changed, however, since the 1970s is ESG issues have become a risk to financial profitability, and when they do that, even if you're not a tree hugger, even if you're not a hippie on a third floor, there's a real reason to address these issues. Currently, ESG is being seen as the 3 letters that will save the planet. What I'm going to talk in the next 10 minutes is before that can happen, we as people who lead organizations need to address some fundamental issues there. So currently, there's much hype about ESG, but my argument is it's flawed in 3 main ways. Flawed in what we measure, flawed in what we disclose, and flawed in the potential impact it can have, and then some solutions about it. So what are the problems with measurement? So ESG, all these 3 letters, almost each one of them carries a universe of indicators under it. Environment is huge, social is huge, governance is even bigger. So you're measuring 3 things which are incredibly complex in and of themselves. The next problem is what shall we measure on? So currently when my team does research on ESG, firms choose to report on GRI, global reporting initiatives. They choose to report to the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. They choose sustainable development goals. And almost every consultant worth their name has their own ESG scorecard. And in fact, you could improve your ESG scores by simply choosing a different metric. So clearly there's a problem on how shall we measure ESG. So it's in a need of the cleanup. The European Union's recognized this. So we had recommendations to the Commission, and they're starting to put some boundaries around how to measure ESG. The US is starting to do that, the Securities Exchange Commission. The problem is they don't match up. So Europe's recommendations on what to measure in ESG doesn't match up with the US, and we don't have one of our own in Australia. So one of the big things that my research team is doing is trying to identify how industries at least can measure the same thing, because unless we do that, all that ESG is doing is creating full employment for consultants and accountants. And that's a great goal, but won't save the planet. The second problem that our research highlights is problems with disclosure. So I've just talked about problems with measurement, problems with disclosure. It's true that what gets measured gets managed, but it's also equally true that what gets measured can get manipulated. So in our research, we found that of 100,000 firms that report on the Morgan Stanley Capital Index, less than 40% report on both your scope 1 and scope 2. So I'm just talking of E, and even within E, a smaller E, the emissions. So the scope 1 emissions, which are your direct emissions, scope 2, your electricity, scope 3, your supply chain. Less than 40% report on both scope 1 and 2. 90% of emissions come from scope 3, which is supply chain, and very few firms report on their scope 3 emissions. So problems with measurement, problems with disclosure, and of course, it means there's a problem with impact. So what we found is currently ESG, the Messiah, it measures the risk that climate change poses to a business. We haven't even started the conversation about how businesses pose a risk to climate change, which is a whole different conversation. So ESG, it gives this impression that a lot is happening, a lot of action is taking place, but at its core, it still allows businesses to externalize their internalities. And what I mean by that is pollution, waste, emission, the costs continue to be borne by society, and we need to internalize them back. So the benefits of ESG continue to be overpromised. So there's this big thing that ESG is the Messiah. Hopefully, I've been able to share my research that because of the problems with measurement, disclosure, impact, it cannot be. And one of the things that's becoming popular is this new fashion that if ESG is so hard to measure, if it's so problematic, why don't we drop off the S and the G? Let's just focus on E. And this is being proposed by think tanks across the globe, by The Economist, which is the high temple of free market liberalism. And even within E, why don't we just focus on emissions? Now, perhaps this is the way we'll go forward, but everything in our research very, very strongly suggests against this decoupling. So I come from a farming family in India, have first-hand experience of what environmental damage does to social cohesion. We've seen this stuff happening in France when they put a tax on petrol and for environmental reasons, and the huge social unrest that happened about 2 years ago. So our research very strongly cautions against decoupling. Yes, they're hard, but what then is the way forward is something I'll wrap up with in my discussion. So we've spent a lot of time to understand how to help firms to make a meaningful commitment to ESG. This is an article we published in the London School of Economics Business Review a few months ago. And our key thoughts in this article are, we shouldn't be yes, I acknowledge ES and G are hard to measure. We're working on standardizing those measurements. Other people across the globe are doing that. But we also need to be mindful that environmental progress cannot happen at the cost of social inequity, and governance is a thread that holds it all together. So we don't need to be decoupling them. If anything, a stronger, more meaningful coupling. We need to standardize these measurements. So within your firms, question what are you measuring on? Look at what can you standardize it across your industry. But above all, a paradox that Clint, you mentioned, you highlighted to it, ESG demands immediate action, but there's a unique paradox. You often have to wait for long terms to see the returns of that. And in our research, we find privately held organizations are often in a much better place to do that. So this is a framework that we've developed from our research about when organizations, when something bad happens, when the mines get blown up, or the first response is, let's focus on building policies. That's our green, the yellow one, the physical space. Policies are great, but policies can only do so much. Till policies are coupled with what we call as a mental space, creating a shared understanding amongst your employees. Until you communicate those policies to your external stakeholders, you can't make meaningful advancements on ESG. So this is a model of ours that's found a lot of traction amongst corporates on how to have policies, then couple them with a shared understanding, and then hold your feet to the fire through getting your external stakeholders involved. So I'll wrap up with this. Another stream of my research is on what kind of leadership do we need for ESG? And all of us here have some form of leadership. So, of course, we need our technical skills. So as a researcher, I need to get my technical skills in order. As a geologist, whatever your areas is, you need those technical skills. You need the basic universal literacy, writing, you need those skills. What we often ignore is the third skill that good leaders need, forensics, a capacity for ethical reasoning. So in my research on wise leadership, and I think wise leadership is critical, core, fundamental to making progress on ESG. So wise leaders don't think in either this or that. Wise leaders, as we've seen, are willing to think in terms of both this and that, short term and the long term. Wise leaders grasp the essence. They see the trees, but they also see the forest, see the immediate picture, but also see a bigger picture. Wise leaders create a shared context for their employees. They also communicate the essence to internal and external stakeholders. And I was having a conversation during lunchtime. The fifth one is something I struggle with. Wise leaders they're not afraid to be political. They're politically savvy in the sense that to sell ESG, you again need to have a really good handle on the pulse of where people are, who are people in influence. So they're politically savvy and they're not afraid to exercise this political power. And finally, wise leaders create practical wisdom. So that's the final thought I'm going to leave you with. We're wrapped in this bubble where we think profits are what matters, and that's true. But outside this bubble, a bigger reality exists. And Peter Senge invites us to think of how wise leaders, they often need to reimagine their life outside the bubble. So where profit maximization is important, but so also is a meaningful commitment to imagination, passion, trust that can lead to some innovative solutions to the challenges we face. So thank you so much. And like a good academic, I have my references there.